Afternoon. I am going to be introducing the Caring Communities Project, which you see up on the slide here. It is a 236-unit supportive housing affordable project developed by Catholic Charities. I'm going to sort of walk you through all of the different organizations that I work with and associated with Catholic Charities. Progressive People's Development Corporation, which is POP Development. I'll use that as sort of an acronym as we go forward. I want to try to avoid using too many acronyms just so I can get a broad base for the whole audience to make sure that everyone's clear with what I'm going over. So if I go through too many acronyms, just flag them and I can explain them at the end of the presentation. But POP Development is a part of the Catholic Charities Brooklyn and Queens, which is also affiliated with the Catholic Charities Neighborhood Services Organization. And all three combined, our mission, POP Development, is to provide affordable housing, and Charities Neighborhood Services provides social services. So you'll see as I go through the presentation how the two work together to provide a comprehensive supportive housing model. So quickly, I want to go through some fun facts about the organization so you know what we've done in the past and sort of what we're working on right now. We've done about 44 projects since 1979. John Tynan here in our office was honored last night for his role in doing these projects since the 70s, so he has a lot of credit to be taken for a lot of these projects. With the number of buildings, about 3,700 units, and what we're going to focus on today is a preservation deal. So out of the 3,700 units, we have refinanced about 1,600 to preserve them. 14 of those were done as preservation projects with tax credits or bond financing. 2 were preservation projects that were year 15 with inclusionary housing from the city, and 2 were just year 15 conversions alone. Since we're focusing on supportive housing today, I'll be talking more about our role in that type of affordable housing development. But I also just want to point out here that 12% of the POP portfolio is supportive housing, but the primary majority of the portfolio is senior housing. To date, we've developed 10% of the city's affordable senior buildings throughout citywide, not just Brooklyn and Queens. So the Caring Communities Project dates back to the 1980s. It was an early model for supportive housing, and it was actually developed during the Ed Koch administration as a way to fix 2 major problems in the city at the time. One was the blight of vacant buildings, and the second was the very high rate of homelessness at that time. So at that time, we, POP Development, took former diocesan property, and we purchased it from the parishes, and we set out to develop a mission that would provide not only taking a former school building that might have been vacant or underutilized and turning that to residential use, we also looked at providing integrated social services for formerly homeless populations. Some of the numbers here quickly. In 1985, it was an approximately $3 million loan from the city that came out to about $10,000 per unit. You can compare that to cost today on similar new construction or rehab projects in the city. You can see just how small that amount was at the time. And then the final piece to the puzzle in 1985 in the original conversion was the HUD moderate rehab contract, which provided the Section 8 rental assistance. So that's important too, because we'll come back to that as I go through the presentation. So what is Caring Communities? It's a portfolio of 3 buildings, as I said before. I'll walk you through each. They're in totally different neighborhoods of Brooklyn, but they all share the common element that they were former church property that was converted to residential use. So the first property is Most Holy Trinity. This is in the East Williamsburg neighborhood of Brooklyn. It's conveniently located between the J and the Z trains as well as the L train, so you can sort of see property has changed significantly over time as both of those lines have become much more sort of desirable for people moving out of the city into Brooklyn. Just a little bit of background on the building. It's interesting. It was a former Dominican order convent, and it was also an orphanage. In 2007, after our initial conversion of the building in 1985, we did a gut renovation, also with city financing. And that was basically to take the building from being an SRO model, that is shared kitchen and baths, to an entirely independent model where individual units would have their own kitchen and bath. So the 2007 renovation basically took 3 separate buildings, pieced them back together. It was quite a process. It's been described to me whereas you walk into the building, you would see from the basement up to the roof, and they basically took out the floors because there was such deterioration at the time. And the current project that I'll talk about that we're currently refinanced last year with conversion of the contract and with additional financing, we are doing more or less just a moderate rehab and mostly focusing on items that weren't done in our 2007 renovation. So that's a full roof replacement and issuing some other issues that have come up over time. Second building is Our Lady of Good Counsel, and this is in the Bed-Stuy neighborhood. This is also another interesting property from a physical or design perspective in that it was 2 former school buildings that were disconnected but operating more or less by the same church. In 1985, we converted both buildings. They operated as a shared kitchen and bath model until 2001. At that time, we did a gut rehab of both buildings. We renovated the units to become studio efficiencies, just like I talked about at Trinity. We also added a lobby addition that connected the 2 buildings and more or less made it a seamless transition for accessibility, adding 2 elevators. And the new work here in this round of renovation we're doing now is it's interesting. There was mothballed spaces in the building that we refer to as mothballed. It's underutilized space. It was a basement area and an auditorium that were, at the time of the original conversion, they just could not be addressed because of the small amount of money that was available from funding. So at this point, we're able to actually go forward and renovate those spaces of the building. And that's where we're actually able to add 22 new units that you see here. And then the last building is St. Joe's. This building is different from Trinity and Good Counsel in that it's not been renovated at all to date. That's not to say that it has not been well maintained. Our architect often refers to this as the most handsome building in Brooklyn. He and us as well really find the building to be, has extremely good bones. As you can see in the photo here, has high floor-to-ceiling heights between each floor. And with this renovation, we're basically taking it from that traditional SRO model to a full independent studio layout. So how are we going to do this? And this is, I think, the focus of what Johanna had asked us to look at is, what are the innovative parts of these projects? We've already tackled some of the biggest issues in that we needed to convert them from SRO units to efficiencies. We've done that at 2 of the buildings. We were really struggling with the 3rd building in that with our previous HUD mod rehab contract, we were not able to bring debt onto the properties. So that would now allow us to do a tax credit or a bond financing, which is what we ultimately are doing now. We looked at the previous models. Everyone had been very happy with the work that had been done on Trinity and Good Counsel in the previous renovations, but we did also have those lingering spaces that we wanted to address. When the entire portfolio is transitioned or completed in construction, we'll have 236 supportive housing units that all operate as studios. So when we set out to do this, our first objective was to restructure the portfolio to bring in a more stable rent structure. Our previous contracts with HUD were done on an annual renewal basis, and that brings a little bit of anxiety as you go through that process yearly. The RAD program, which I'm not sure how many people here are familiar with that, but it's the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program, and that was put out by HUD in 2012, and that was really geared towards helping public housing authorities to address converting public housing vouchers to Section 8 vouchers. Given our carve-out of a mod rehab contract, we were also in that program and lucky enough to be eligible to convert from the previous mod rehab contract to a new 20-year long-term Section 8 contract. It also allowed us to bring in enhanced rents. Our rents prior to conversion were about $800 on average for the units, depending on if they were SRO or studio. With the new contract that we gained from HUD, we were able to go up to about 108% of the fair market rent for these type of units in these neighborhoods. So that comes out to about $1,200 per unit. So that added capital and sort of ongoing investment in the building allowed us to bring in the additional debt that I'll talk about next. The Rad process, many people have some questions there just because if you look at it from an outsider's perspective, again, it's really geared towards public housing authorities. We had tremendous assistance from our consultant team that we worked with, which included Nixon Peabody, Forsyth Street Advisors, and Richmond Housing Resources. And with that team, all trusted advisors, all people that we had worked with before, we were actually able to navigate the Rad process pretty smoothly. The Rad team from HUD brought in outside advisors to help them sort of get this to a closing. So we more or less ended up with 2 closings, which was another sort of, I wouldn't call it an obstacle, but it was definitely a 2-tiered closing that some people may not normally encounter on these types of deals. And then finally, once we had the Rad approval, that was done last September, that enabled us to go forward with an HFA, so State's Housing Finance Agency, tax-exempt bonds, as well as low-income housing tax credit deal. Our next objective with the project was to, as we talked about before, repurpose underutilized space throughout the portfolio. So you can see here, we're now in construction. Construction began last December. The buildings have a staggered process that they'll go through given the amount of construction that will take place in each property. But these are our 2 buildings. The one on the top is St. Joseph's, and this is the basement. The left side of the image will actually be new social service space, and the right side of the image, you imagine a double-loaded corridor here in a few weeks, hopefully. Those will be new apartments. So we're actually, at St. Joe's, even though we're bringing down the size of the we're adding in kitchen and baths, which eats up more space in the building. We were actually able to keep the existing number of units by using the basement space. So that was a big sort of objective for us from the beginning, was to try to make the building as efficient as possible. That'll make maintenance and operations much easier as we go forward. The third objective we had, talked about already, was the conversion of the SRO units to new studio apartments. So we already had the model for that in place at Counsel and Trinity. Again, at St. Joe's, we had to look closely at the building's design. It was a very compact building. We weren't really looking to add any additions to the building, and we didn't want to lose any units. So we had to really go back and forth with our architect, which is Datner, to look at the floor layouts, make sure that the studio units would meet the minimum square footage requirement for the city, and then it would also just be providing a nice place for a supportive housing model. So you can see some of the images here. They will have more or less a kitchenette, and they also have their own bathroom and a pretty moderately sized unit, but it's about 300 square feet on average. So some of the challenges and the next steps that we face are the fact that we're doing a gut rehab in an occupied building at St. Joseph's. So our phase relocation plan is underway. We started earlier this spring. We moved about 6 units at that time. What we're doing is we're calling it like a hopscotch pattern throughout the building, where we move one side to another. We've also had to move some residents out of the building into other buildings in our supportive housing model, our supportive housing portfolio. And what we anticipate at this point is our next big phase or relocation move occurs in September. At that time, we will be able to sort of swing people into vacant units and then sort of move people back into new units that will be created in that space I just showed you before. And then phase 3 is our biggest lift, and that's next spring, and that's when we move more or less half of the building at one time, but also bringing people back into newly constructed units. So there's a lot of construction challenges here working with MDG. and that we have to make sure our phase relocation matches up with all the permit approval requirements that are necessary. And then you can just see here at the bottom, construction completion. It does vary by building based on the amount of work that we're doing. Trinity, as I explained before, is a moderate rehab. Most of the work is exterior. We anticipate that'll be completed by the end of this year. Good Counsel, we set that up as an 18-month process, and that'll be completed by next June. That'll include the 22 new units, new social service and office space, as well as some systems repairs, roof replacements that we're working on. And then finally, St. Joe's is the biggest lift for the portfolio in that it's a 2-year phase relocation, gut rehab. So we anticipate that'll be completed by December of 2015.